everybody, welcome to the Basis Points Podcast. I'm Kevin Flanagan, head of fixed income strategy at Wisdom Tree Asset Management. I hope everybody had a wonderful 4th of July and 4th of July weekend. Back at it now. We're really into summer now, right? Once 4th of July hits and we move into the later part of the month and into August. So it's interesting. I wanted to talk about when will the yield curve uninvert? It's been a topic for a lot of discussion lately. You know, the last time I spoke to you, I talked about how the inverted Treasury yield curve may have lost some of its predictive luster with respect to foreshadowing a recession, at least up to this point anyway. But this topic is one that I've been mentioning and discussing in client meetings, and it's slowly becoming a hot topic, and that's the timing for when will the U.S. Treasury yield curve uninvert. In other words, move out of negative territory. And before I go further, I think it's important to understand the dynamics behind yield curve movements. Remember, we're talking about two potentially moving parts, short-term rates and longer-term rates. And interestingly, there can be a misconception that all rates tend to move in the same direction, but history's shown us that's not necessarily the case. You know, in addition, even short-term and long-term rates, if they're moving in the same direction, it's the magnitude of this movement that can dictate yield curve developments. And the two curves that I wanted to talk about here and are closely followed by the markets are the Treasury 3-month 10-year and the Treasury 2-year 10-year differentials. Now, these two constructs went in inverted territory during the fall and summer of 2022, respectively. And the magnitude of these negative spread relationships reached historical proportions. You know, for example, the peak, if you want to call it that, negative reading for the 3-month 10-year relationship reached a low watermark of 190 basis points, while the 2-year 10-year spread plummeted to a low of almost 110 basis points. And both of these milestones occurred around the spring of last year. So let's put this into some perspective for where things stand as I'm talking to you here today. And in case of the former spread, that 3-month 10-year, the level is now at 107 basis points. And for the 2-year 10-year, it's 32 basis points. So this steepening has helped to bring about the very topic that we're talking about right here. But it should be noted, we have seen this movie before during this current inverted cycle. So what could make this time different? And that's the potential for Fed rate cuts. You know, in fact, the underlying premise behind the discussion of when the yield curve could move out of negative territory is, in fact, Fed rate cuts. So let's go back to what impacts rates along the maturity spectrum for a better understanding. Short-term yields are going to be anchored by that Fed funds rate, while longer-dated maturities are affected by not only monetary policy, but also economic and inflation expectations, and at times fiscal policy as well. So given the current level of inversion for these two yield curves, one could make the case the 2-year 10-year spread could be the first to move out of negative territory. If the Fed cuts rates, say, twice this year and continues into early 2025, odds would favor this differential going back to zero or maybe even positive, because the 2-year yield would more than likely fall to or below the rate for the 10-year, and that's obviously given its tighter correlation to the Fed funds rate. And remember, the negative reading here is only, those were air quotes for everybody out there, 32 basis points. Now, the timing for the 3-month 10-year uninversion could take longer due to the fact the negative reading is more than 1 full percentage point. Remember, 107 basis points. So in order to reverse this negative spread, the Fed would need to be more aggressive cutting rates than is currently expected. You know, for instance, keeping the 10-year yield where it is now, around, say, 4.30, technically the Fed would need to cut rates more than 4 times, so greater than 100 basis points in total, just to get this spread back to zero. So unless the economy, especially the labor market, falters in a visible fashion, our reasonable case scenario sees the Fed rate cut cycle as being more choppy, one where easing moves are limited to, say, 25 basis point increments and don't necessarily occur at consecutive FOMC meetings. And for all intents and purposes, this type of rate cut cycle should more than likely result in yield curve steepening, but the timing could be different depending upon what curve you're looking at. So let's wrap it up. As you can see, sometimes in the grand scheme of things, when you're analyzing yield curve trends, sometimes it just comes down to the math. So I'm going to leave it there. Have a great rest of the week, everybody, and be well.